Canada is facing a turning point in its economic trajectory. The national unemployment rate climbed to 6.9% in April 2025, the highest level since the end of last year, signaling growing unease across labor markets. This comes as economic growth continues to stall and pressure mounts on policymakers to make meaningful action. While the OECD maintains that Canada will likely avoid a technical recession in 2025, the economy is expected to experience stagnation throughout the year. To better understand how businesses and investors can adapt to this period of volatility, we're now joined by Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, thanks for joining me today.
Theresa, good to be here. Glad we still both have jobs.
Now, as of April 2025, Canada's unemployment rate, as I mentioned, rose to 6.9%, the highest level since the end of 2024. How do you think the rising unemployment rate will affect investor confidence?
Well, it's a funny thing. The the real benchmark is what's going on in the U.S. and their unemployment rate, although measured differently than Canada, they in the United States they don't consider if you've stopped looking for work, you're not considered unemployed and therefore don't figure in the stats, which is odd. Uh, but here in Canada, I mean, our rate is an objectively higher than in the US. So
Mm.
I don't know that Canadian investors really look at the unemployment rate as the benchmark for how well companies in the economy are doing. And what's happening, of course, in the last little while is that people are either not hiring or not keeping people as technology has begun to do a number of the jobs that particularly entry level so-called white collar workers or office workers have been doing. So there's been a a reluctance. It's been a terrible, for example, it's been a terrible summer for young people trying to get summer jobs, particularly if they're looking for something in a particular uh, office type career. So uh, I think it's going to be very challenging. It'll infect investors in as much as, at least at the margins, there won't be as much money for investors to put into the market. And Canadian stocks are largely bought by Canadian investors. We have, I mean, there's home country bias in every part of the world where investors are more likely to buy stocks within the country in which they live. But it's particularly high in Canada, where we like our own brands, and so to the extent that there are fewer people with free disposable cash to put into the market, it may, at the margins, affect stock prices.
And what impact might the high unemployment rate have on Canadian corporate earnings forecasts and stock market performance in the next 6 to 12 months?
Well, perversely, at least in some areas, it may actually help corporate earnings because, again, if you're taking technology and using it in place of flesh and blood human beings, that could actually, at least in theory, boost earnings because, in theory, those that remain are more efficient, more work can get done at less cost. So, in theory, it could actually boost corporate earnings. In terms of stock prices, I think there is something of a correlation, but not a direct correlation between unemployment and stock prices. It's more, I think it's going to be more sector by sector, with other factors like trade being bigger influencers.
And what risk management strategy should Canadian companies and investors adopt in the face of these industries that are severely affected by trade?
Yeah, I think it's the trade is going to be the big one. So I had said, and I still stand by it, that Canadian companies or Canada as a country should not engage in retaliatory tariffs. I think if anything, and I'm encouraged that our prime minister has been talking about this, interprovincial trade barriers, barriers to trading within our own country, that is, should be taken down because maybe it's come as a surprise to people, but to move goods or services between Ontario and Quebec or Quebec and Manitoba or really anywhere across the country, there are actually barriers to doing that to the extent that we are a united country with only 40 and a little bit million people. We do have to be more unified, particularly in a world that's becoming increasingly fragmented when we could more easily trade directly with the United States or internationally. then okay, it doesn't necessarily matter that we be able to tap into the couple million strong Manitoba market. But absent a coherent global trade network, which was the case for the last several decades, as that's beginning to be dismantled, we have to be, I think, stronger across our country. From an investment perspective, how best to attack it? Well, you could say financial services should be somewhat immune to trade barriers, so the banks should do well. But of course, as we've seen in the United States, they will pursue nationalism by other means. I mean, the fine against the TD Bank for money laundering ran into the billions, and worse, has they've been legally prevented. The bank has been legally prevented from expanding in the U.S. And I think it's the case of all the big Canadian banks. There is a limit to how much you can grow in this country. Again, there's only 40 million people to bank for. So I do think that it's going to need to be a case by case, industry by industry, and indeed company by company investment strategy here in Canada as to which ones will do better than others. Ones that I think are particularly vulnerable continue to be ones reliant on trade, particularly in industries that the U.S. president seems to think are going to be able to be built fully in the United States, like auto parts. So I think that could be a tricky one. On the other hand, when you're looking at an industry like auto parts, to the extent that this whole protectionist discussion goes away, or at least diminishes in importance, you could see a rebound in auto parts and other heavily US oriented exporting sectors.
And which industries have shown resilience in the face of a weak job market? And can these industries absorb unemployment labor in other industries?
I think it'll be tricky because again, this unemployment. I mean, there was an article in the papers just over the weekend about people who've gone to school to be computer programmers. Well, you think if you could learn to code, learn to make the computers work, surely there'll be always be a job for you. But apparently, one of the highest unemployment rates amongst recent graduates is with computer programmers, people who know how to code. I have been resilient in my knowledge, not even to know how to make a spreadsheet work. I can tell you what's wrong with your spreadsheet and what whether the numbers that are spit out of it are correct or not. So interpreting the data, I can do, but those that actually know how to put the data together are actually under a lot of job pressure because apparently AI can do a lot of that stuff. So um, I do think it'll be tricky to go from industry to industry. Now, every generation over the last little while has thought, okay, this time it's it. This time we're not going to be as well off as our parents. Going back to even Generation X when we graduated in the early 90s, and then the internet came along. I do think the present generation will be resilient to the changes that have taken place because they are much more familiar with the technology and will figure out a way to improvise, adapt, overcome, and indeed create their own employment opportunities.
Now, we do have about a minute, but you talk about how computer science majors, you thought they would always have a job, now they might not. Do you think that this unemployment rate rising, even though people are showing resiliency or younger Canadians are showing resiliency, do you think that people are going to be more hesitant to not go to school because they're seeing a high unemployment rate?
I think school should be done differently than it has been. It was one thing in my youth when it was maybe $2,000 tuition, 1980s, 1990s dollars tuition to get a degree in something. It was interesting intellectually and a wonderful place to park a young person until their frontal cortex was somewhat fully formed. But I think there will be a greater emphasis on apprenticeships. Uh, Even those that go to university realize that they need to know how to do something practical at the end of it. So I do think university will need to be done differently. That all having been said, my master's degree is Renaissance English literature, and be able to express oneself and have an interpersonal connection will likely be the worth quite a bit going forward as the world becomes increasingly automated.
Well, Brennan, thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, Teresa.